Hello, wonderful people of the internet. Welcome back to the Anthony Morris Returns channel. My name is Chaka, and in this video, we'll be going through 12 things that we learned from the 2024 Declare the Good News Jehovah's Witnesses Convention. And here to discuss these things with me are my fellow ex-JWs and YouTube content creators from the channel Difficult Childhood. So I'm very pleased to welcome Jason and Falon. Please welcome to the channel.
Hi.
Thank you.
It's great to have you guys, and I hope this is the first of many videos we're going to create together.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, we're excited.
Yeah. So I'm looking forward to discussing the things that we learned from this year's Jehovah's Witness Convention. The idea with this is just to think about the direction the organization is going in terms of the doctrines and the policies. So hopefully the three of us can make sense of that. So let's roll the intro and get into it.
But you can't do that, said one of the critics.
It doesn't bother me. Really? Again? Really?
Look at that little enemy of God.
Somehow we dilly-and-dally, takes us years, and we wonder why.
What are you waiting for?
So the way we're going to do this is that I'm going to present a thesis in terms of what we've learned from a particular segment of the 2024 Jehovah's Witnesses Convention. Then we're going to play a clip that illustrates that point from the convention, and then we're just going to comment. I'm not going to mention the title of the talk or the convention item from which this point or the clip is taken, but I will put graphics on the screen so that you'll be able to see, if you have the convention program, you'll be able to see from what particular segment of the convention this item was taken. We are now just going to play the first clip, and before we play it, the point that we're going to take from this clip is, according to the Jehovah's Witness leadership, the end is not coming anytime soon.
We're waiting nearly 4 years since it was announced. At this convention, we will have the privilege of seeing the first episode of the new series entitled The Good News According to Jesus. Now, this particular series is an 18-episode epic portrayal of Jesus' life and his teachings.
My first thought when they announced, this mini series based on Jesus, and I've heard so many people online talk about what a big budget it is to launch this series. The first thing that stood out to me was it's all done by volunteers. So to say it's so expensive to produce it, expensive by what standards? Like, it's all done in-house. So I don't really feel like it's that expensive. But the other idea that came to me was, part of my brain wondered if they looked to the money-making possibilities that could come from it compared to other like Christian-themed miniseries. You're probably familiar with like The Chosen, which is like a Christian-based series that started in 2017, and it's grossed tens and tens and tens of millions of dollars worldwide, and it is faith-based, but it's very popular. It's on multiple streaming services, and it's a big draw for people, even if they don't. It's not one religion or the other. It's just a general Christian-themed series. So part of my brain wondered if maybe they looked to that and thought, hey, like this is maybe an opportunity to like turn a little coin, because it just seems so different than what they've done in the past.
Yeah, interesting. And I think I saw something on the internet where in Colombia they're actually showing some of the videos that they've produced in the past. I think it was the Daniel video that they were showing on mainstream TV. Now, whether they're getting any revenue from that is it's an open question, but you can see them monetizing this movie making enterprise that they've gone into in the near future.
Yeah, it makes sense. I was struck by, he said 18-part, and I don't know how far they're gapping this, But 18 part, if this is at conventions only, which I don't think it is, but if it were, we've got 18 safe years where they're not, the end's not going to come because we have to finish this Jesus video. It's a silly argument, but the fact that they're investing this much into hopefully educating new members is the idea, and keeping current members, it does put the goalpost out a little bit farther for the end to come.
Yeah, and those were my thoughts as well, because he mentioned they've waited 4 years. So since they announced it, so they had the idea in mind, and then it's taken 4 years for them to release the very first installment. So there were people 4 years ago who were hoping for the end to come, but they had to wait until this series started. And then you're talking potentially 18 more years, because the idea is they're definitely going to be showing, at least they're going to be premiering it at the conventions. So next year, I showed a clip from in the video where I sort of tried to summarize everything that was said in the convention. I showed a clip from the last talk where they've shown bits of what they're going to show next year. So next year, they're going to do 2 episodes. But even if, for argument's sake, even if you were to say that they're going to do 2 episodes in a year in subsequent years, you're still talking at least 10 years before Armageddon comes in their mind anyway. So if you're a Jehovah's Witness, it just begs the question, why are you believing this end of the world rhetoric when the leaders are making plans years and years into the future? If these are leaders that believe that the end was imminent, why would they be making these multi-year projects that, you know, where you're talking about a generation? There will be people that will be born now in the first episode, and they will be fully grown by the time they release the final episode, if we expect 1 to 2 episodes a year.
Yeah, it's nuts. I thought the from the perspective of, say, if somebody has a terminal illness or a very serious painful illness, say it's not terminal, and they have a painful illness, and I really hope the new system comes this year, and they see this and they go, oh, rats, that's years out for me of suffering now that I've got to wait through.
Yeah,
that's rough.
Yeah, shameful. Anyway, let's have a look at the second point we gleaned from the convention, which is that the governing body have absolutely no interest in scholars' opinions on topics related to the Bible. I'll say except, and we'll talk about the except after we see the clip.
Mark, Luke, and John were no ordinary writers or historians who just documented extraordinary events of their time. No, like all Bible writers, they spoke from God. Matthew wrote his gospel for the benefit of the Jews, the Hebrews. And it appears that Matthew first wrote his gospel in Hebrew only about 8 years after Jesus' death, long before the other gospels. Later, it seems, though, that Matthew also translated his gospel himself from Hebrew to Greek to make it more widely available. Matthew is uniquely fuzzy with numbers and money, just what you would expect from an ex-taxman. As we said, Matthew was a former tax collector, and he himself plainly acknowledged that. When he lists the names of the 12 apostles in Matthew chapter 10, verse 3, he doesn't mention the background of any of the other apostles, but he mentions Matthew, the tax collector. In Matthew 26:56, he also admits that all the disciples, including himself, abandoned Jesus and fled. In Matthew 28:17, he admits that some disciples doubted even when they saw the resurrected Jesus. Another reason to trust Matthew is that he personally knew Jesus. He spent much time with Jesus. Matthew was an eyewitness. He was at the scene. He was there when it happened. There are some critics who say that the 4 Gospels contradict each other in some places. But to sincere readers, such criticism seems petty and trivial and can easily be proven wrong.
And likewise with Mark. When he wrote the gospel that's in his name, he prayed for Jehovah's Holy Spirit.
Now, as a physician, Luke was well educated. What one gospel writer may simply refer to as leprosy, Luke refers to it as a man full of leprosy. What might simply be an illness or a fever to one gospel writer, Luke refers to it as a high fever. Luke became a believer after Jesus' death and therefore was not an eyewitness to the events he records in his gospel. 3 times Luke is favorably mentioned in the Christian Greek scriptures. Paul calls Luke the beloved physician, my fellow worker.
It was John who was known as the disciple whom Jesus loved. I find it surprising that there are some who call themselves Bible scholars, students of the ancient writings, who doubt the authenticity of John's work.
Falon, you being the only believing Christian among us today, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this rhetoric of literal Matthew wrote the book of Matthew, literal Mark wrote the book of Mark, literal Luke wrote the book of Luke, and literal John wrote the book of John. What's kind of the conversation on that in mainstream Christianity?
There's a lot of debate in even all other religions, whether they were directly written or the books were named after the apostles at a later time. But what I took away from it was that they're only interested in scholarship towards the writings in the areas that it applies to them, or it supports, their narrative. But it's the same thing that they feel in science. They only consider science articles or scientific viewpoints when it supports their narrative on creation, or they only consider doctors' advice when it supports their narrative that surgery can be done without blood. So the fact that they're saying this is the only way, it didn't really surprise me.
Yeah, 100%. Jason?
Yeah. And even though Falon and I don't, I'm a non-believer, she's a believer, I really agree with your point here, because they are saying, oh, Matthew wrote Matthew. And there's a ton of evidence that Matthew didn't write Matthew, including the fact that Mark has 661 verses, and 600 of those are found almost verbatim in Matthew. And Mark's writings are a little more primitive, not quite as cleanly edited. You look at the early manuscripts, they're not quite as clean. They're not quite as sharply done. It's very clear that later down the road, very much likely early Christian adherence to Matthew's point of view filled in the book of Matthew, which would be fine. It doesn't invalidate the gospel. I think there are other things that do, but this doesn't invalidate the gospel, in my opinion. It is really, it's just absurd that the organization, like Fallon said, just ignores any analysis that doesn't agree with them. It wouldn't be a problem to say, we don't know that if Matthew wrote this.
Right.
There's other schools of thought. It wouldn't be a problem, but they can't do it. There's that arrogance of the governing body at work.
100%. And you could see them actually contradicting themselves, like the first speaker that talks about Matthew, and this is what I find frustrating in the Jehovah's Witness organization, because that man seems highly intelligent. He is very eloquent. He was literally, because I watched through the whole thing for 18 hours, and he was one of those people that you could actually find compelling as a speaker in terms of just everything about him, his appearance, the way he presents, his eloquence and so on. But when you're in this religion, you're just told to quash any sort of critical thinking. And even if you're a highly intelligent person, you will be spouting this nonsense, because he's talking about Matthew being the writer. And then he talks about Matthew writing things in the third person. Matthew, he wrote about Matthew, the tax collector. If Matthew was writing about himself, if he was the writer of that book, why would he be writing about himself in the third person? That is absurd. There is nowhere in the Bible where we have a Bible writer that's writing events in which they're included and then they write in the third person. There is no Bible book where that happens, and they have to make this argument because for them, I guess, it's about the credibility of the Gospels. If there were eyewitnesses who wrote some of the Gospels, some of Jesus's apostles, then it adds a lot of authority in their opinion. But as I think we all agree, I don't think that would change anybody's opinion of the Gospels, whether they were written by eyewitnesses, whether they were written by the actual apostles. And there are even Bible scholars who are believing Christians, firmly believing Christians, and they agree with what the scholarly consensus is that these books were written by anonymous authors, and at the end of the day, in the grand scheme of things, it doesn't really matter. So it's just strange that in the 21st century they're still making this argument, which scholars, even from the 1800s, maybe the 1700s, would not be saying. Then as in, the consensus would not be that these were written by the four names to whom they are attributed.
Right.
Yeah.
Crazy.
Yeah. So I just found the kind of the derogatory terms that are used towards scholars. Like, why is that necessary? Why say things like people who call themselves scholars? These are people don't call themselves scholars. Other people call them scholars because they have gone to university. They have spent years studying these writings. They can read, unlike the governing body members or the helpers or any high-ranking Jehovah's Witness. These people can read these texts in the original languages. They have looked at various manuscripts. They've studied the different manuscripts. They don't just call themselves, or people don't just start calling them scholars. And even if you are someone with a doctorate, for you to have like a standing in the in the scholarly community, you have to have published lots of books to have source of authority. So it's not just the fact that they go and get a PhD and then people start calling them scholars, and this disrespectful attitude to people who have dedicated their lives to study these things. And as I think you alluded to, if it's something that favors their thoughts, then they will quote that scholar, even if that scholar, if you look at the context. So they do this in the Watchtower, where they say a scholar said this, and if you Google that statement, you look at the general writings of that scholar, you find that they're totally in disagreement with the governing body's ideas. But if he makes one sentence, if he says one sentence that agrees with the ideas, then they'll latch on to that. So it's shameful the way they approach scholarship.
They did. You're right. What you said about the papers that these scholars will have written, they're peer reviewed, and they stand up to scrutiny, or they don't, and they fall apart, and then a new thinking comes, a fresh perspective comes. But none of that happens with any of the writings that the governing body do.
Absolutely, yeah. Anyway, we need to move on to the third thing we learned from this year's convention, the 2024 convention, and that is that the Christmas prohibition is here to stay. So let's have a look at this clip.
When was Jesus Christ born? Many would answer, December 25th. On that date, Christmas is celebrated worldwide, even in many non-Christian countries. The Bible does not give an exact date for Jesus' birth, but it does indicate something that would surprise many. He was not born in the winter. The Bible tells us that around the time of Jesus' birth, Caesar Augustus ordered a general census. To comply with it, Jesus' parents had to travel at least 110 kilometers or 68 miles from Nazareth to Bethlehem. It is unlikely that Augustus would order the Jews who were already inclined to revolt to make long trips in the harsh conditions of winter. Third, the Bible points to a different time for Jesus' birth. The book of Luke says that Jesus was baptized and began his work at about 30 years of age. And Daniel prophesied that Jesus' ministry would last 3.5 years. Jesus died on the Passover in the spring at 33.5 years of age. So his birth, 33.5 years earlier, would have been in autumn. Thus, the Bible indicates that Jesus was born not in winter, but in autumn.
Christmas was such a happy time for my family. I was happy because we could be together as a family. My husband passed away when the children were still very young, and I felt very lonely. Our lives had completely changed. So I would pray to God, and all I would say was, God, wherever you are, please help me to raise my children well. If the witnesses come by again, this time I will listen to them. They answered all my questions using the Bible. I began to learn what the Bible says about Jesus' birth, and I found it difficult to grasp. What I had always been taught wasn't what the Bible said. I realized that what I was studying was the truth. I stopped thinking of Jesus as a little baby. A lot of people didn't like what I was learning. My parents came to my house, and they said they would kick me out of town if I didn't stop studying. But I decided that what I was learning from the Bible was more important. I was able to teach my children about who Jesus is and what he will do for the earth. Many years have gone by since we gave up those Christmas traditions. I'm so pleased to see how my children are doing because of following Bible teachings. Now, I am truly happy.
I guess it's only in the Jehovah's Witness religion where people have to say they're happy. Like, why do you have to say you're happy? If you're happy, just be happy, right?
But how else would people know if you didn't say specifically?
I know. Falon, again, you are the only believing Christian among us, so
Well,
go for it.
I'm just going to say, without Christmas, it's very sad. When I was growing up, if there was one policy as a child that I wish they would change, it was not blood. When I was 8, 9, 10 years old, it was 100% Christmas. Like, you can skip the blood, but like, give me the presents. But again, I mean, none of this is surprising. It's all, kind of just regurgitated things that we've heard before. Christmas is bad. And of all the policies that they could change, I definitely think Christmas would not be on the list, because they would not only have to flip-flop on holidays, the Christmas holiday, but they'd also have to flip-flop on celebrating birthdays, because it also, by normal Christians, is recognized as Jesus' birth. So they're not gonna give you a twofer. So they're just gonna double down and say, don't do it, it's bad.
Interesting.
I was struck by the Emperor Augustus comments here. Now, I think that December 25th was not derived from anything biblical. I realize it was from other sources. That's why they landed on that. It was, that's a whole other episode. But their excuses for how they know that Jesus wasn't born on December 25th are hilarious. One, Emperor Augustus, he didn't want them traveling during inclement weather. You know what the weather's like in Bethlehem in December? It's ideal for traveling. It is, the average temperature, I looked it up, is 14 to 18 degrees Celsius or 57 to 65 degrees Fahrenheit. It is lovely. Now, there are different elevations and stuff, but the general region gets on average, one dusting of snow per year. It is not Canada. What are they talking about? That he didn't want them to have to travel during. And also, Emperor Augustus didn't care about their convenience. He was not there to serve the Jews. He was there to get a tax assessment and move on. He didn't care about that. You can tell that it wasn't a worry that the Hebrews might have been an uprising, because they didn't have any army. Later on, when Jerusalem got destroyed, the Romans sent in their army and it was done. So it was not a concern. And then the final one, they say, well, we know he must have been born in the autumn, because Daniel prophesied that Jesus' ministry would last 3.5 years. You do all the math, comes out to 30 years and everything. You do all this work. Well, and this is one that's going to, be debatable among individuals, who are listening to this, and even here on the panel. Daniel, in my opinion, is completely debunked as a fraud. It is full of language shifts where you're like, well, somebody wrote this section in effectively Old English style, and somebody else wrote this in effectively modern English style, because of the amount of time that transpired during different chapters and when they were written. So you can prove fairly conclusively that Daniel should probably be kicked out of the Bible canon. So stop using Daniel as a way to calculate that when Jesus was born. And they do all this work. All three of these things make no sense whatsoever. And they do all this work, and all it buys them is 3 months, 2.5 months, maybe. Oh yeah, we think it was autumn. Yeah. It's so much work for nothing, when they could have just said, oh, December 25th, here's the source of that. So we don't know exactly when Jesus was born, but we know it wasn't December 25th, or it very likely wasn't. It was a 1 in 365 chance. So much work they did for that, just to try to look different and try to look like they're scholars.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's the fact that they actually contradict, the arguments are so silly, because the verse they're appealing to as a pivotal point says Jesus was about 30 years old. So what does about 30 years old mean? Like I was told this person is about 30, I would think they could be 28, they could be 29, they could be 30, they could be 31, 32, 33. Like it wasn't important to the Bible writers, but then they take it literally, like that was his literal birthday. The day he was born in autumn of whatever 2 BCE, that's the day he got baptized, and that's how they are calculating the whole thing. So it's just really, really silly. And the other thing, so you've made really good points in terms of the scholarship, Jason. But the other point I was just going to talk about, coming back to Falon's point, is with regards to Christmas. I know it's a big thing for Jehovah's Witnesses in terms of standing out, and they're making these meaningless changes now in terms of women can turn up in wearing pants to the meetings, men can turn up without a tie. And if the idea is to blend in and to make the Jehovah's Witnesses' lives less difficult, this is one of the things they could easily drop, because even I appreciate, as a child, obviously you feel the difference when all the other kids are getting presents and all that. But even as a grown-up, you have all these awkward conversations when there's a Christmas do at work, when people are writing cards and all that. You have to be explaining yourself all the time. And this is one of those meaningless prohibitions that they could just get rid of and just make the Jehovah's Witnesses' lives easier, but they're doubling down on it. And I've covered the talk. Like, I didn't want to show too much of the talk, but I've covered it in the video where I kind of captured the key things that were said in the convention. So if anyone hasn't seen it, maybe have a look at that. But the guy they use as well, he just goes on this anti-Christmas rant, and I found it quite surprising, because I kind of expect that they would drop the birthday prohibition in the very near future. It's not their priority, but I found it surprising that they're doubling down on the Christmas prohibition.
That is interesting. Oh, and I agree with Falon on one very important point. I love Christmas too. It's amazing.
It's amazing, but the Grinch has stolen it away already, so for us. Anyway, we need to move on to the next thing we learned from the 2024 convention, which is that misogyny continues to be a massive issue in the Jehovah's Witness religion.
In Proverbs chapter 31, we find the description of the capable wife. Specifically in verse 15, it says that she provides food and other provisions. Here's a sampling of what might have been in a typical day for the mother and her daughters. How would they begin? Caring for basic household chores. What would they be? Fill the oil lamps, sweep the floors, milking the family's goat. Then it would be time to make bread for the day. The daughters would first sift the grain to remove impurities, and then grind that grain to a coarse flour, and as we have just seen, using a stone hand mill. Later in the morning, the mother and her daughters would head to the local marketplace. There they would buy supplies for that day. What might that be? Fresh vegetables, dried fish, that might be on the menu. Then there was the visit to the well, because they would have to replenish the family's water supply for that day. Then the baking would begin. Then let's not forget the washing of clothes, probably in a nearby stream. Then it's time to begin cooking the evening meal.
we have to start with you, Falon, there. Your thoughts as a woman listening to such talk.
So to hear them describe, what an ancient woman would be doing during her day, I mean, that doesn't offend me as a woman or a Christian. Thousands of years ago, maybe that is how they would spend their day, and good for them. And if you are a woman today and you choose to live the more traditional housewife life, good for you. You're not hurting anybody. But when they describe sisters within the organization, they'll use phrases like, "Oh, they're a large army. They're a powerful force in the organization. They make up the brunt of the ministry work," which is all true. But then they don't give any explanation to why sisters are only entitled to a teeny tiny little fraction of the privileges that brothers are given, and hardly any of the accolades. So if the traditional wifely housewife thing is for you, great. If you're a career woman, great. But don't expect for those to fit into like the JW narrative.
100%.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm struck by if the Hebrew society back then had been Jehovah's organization, a loving God's organization on earth, by comparison, Jehovah knows the future and how much more convenient things get, the complete lack of microwaves and everything else that makes life easy. You would thought that, Jehovah would have had a law, something like saying, hey, way back now, the guys need to help more. It's real hard on women.
Yeah.
And of course, instead, the women, again, were doing the bulk of the work, just like in the modern day organization. Women are doing the bulk of the work in terms of preaching, way more work. And there's no respect for that. And there's no help, very little help. And that's just, it didn't seem like that was anything special then either. That wasn't a special organization of God's. And of course, and today, this isn't a special organization of God's.
100%. And I think I would respect them more if they said, well, that was the situation then. We understand that was the situation then. And we understand why women had to take on so much work then, because maybe the men were out in the field, growing crops and doing whatever, doing this hard labor, fishing and all that. But now we understand now that this is not the way it should be. But there was no talk like that in that talk. It was just talked about like that's the way it was supposed to have been. And the problem with talks like this is they use these biblical examples to then present a very misogynistic agenda. So I did a video on the channel where I commented on a talk by Mark Newmer, who is a helper to the teaching committee of the governing body. He gave, and he's a Gilead instructor, and he gave this talk where he just invented stuff about the Apostle Peter's wife. And then he was using that to push this misogynistic agenda of the women. He basically said, if your husband invites people to, if you're a Bethelite, you have a room at Bethel and your husband is a high-ranking Bethelite. If he brings people unannounced, you just need to do the cooking and the cleaning for the people that he brings unannounced. Like literally, those were his words. And I'm going to put a thumbnail here to that video. So this is the problem with them appealing to such examples. It's not like they're just talking about them as historical facts. They're saying this is the expectation of you as a modern day Jehovah's Witness woman, because if Peter's wife did it, if the woman in Israel did it, what makes you so special so that you don't do all the hard graft? And I think it's kind of very dangerous rhetoric, and this is why I decided to play it both in this video and in the video I did where I sort of summarized the whole convention together.
Yeah, I think it would have been a good opportunity for them to show how they've evolved. People get upset with like changes within the organization, but I think this could have been a chance for them to say, look how far we've come since those original roles.
Yeah, 100%. Right. So moving on to the next thing we learned from the 2024 Jehovah's Witnesses Convention, it was that the Jehovah's Witnesses view angels as playthings.
Well, you may have had your own experience where you felt that the angels were directing things, and there's so many experiences that indicate that they're working right alongside us. I'd like to just share one. There was a sister working or looking for a way to give a witness, and she was in line at the grocery store, and the grocery conveyor belt stopped, and the customers all around became upset and began to complain and were very rude to the cashier, who actually was very kind to them in return. Well, the sister thought in her mind, this is my opportunity. So when she got up to the cashier, she said, I want to commend you for being so kind and patient, even though everyone else was so rude. You see, I'm one of Jehovah's Witnesses, and I notice things like that. Well, what do you think the response was? The cashier said, now wait just a minute. You're one of Jehovah's Witnesses? And she reached in her bag and she pulled out a letter. She said, I got a letter from one of Jehovah's Witnesses. I've been reading it over and over, and it's so encouraging. Needless to say, a Bible study was started. But our sister walked away with the idea, the angels are even working in the supermarkets now.
This is it. Hold on.
Go ahead, Jay.
Okay, first of all, this is I'm gonna focus on the car part because I'm more of a car person. This is a debranded Nissan Micra. This guy is about 15 years old. It puts out about, at this point, probably about 50 horsepower. They've got 4 adults in it. They're hauling through, and he just goes, here it goes. I guess we'll rely on the angels. Just like in the videos, we learned that the angels are out here, helping us through everywhere, including the supermarket. So they blast through and go up this hill, and then the angels there going, whoosh, and that's great. But then I was struck by how I have seen firsthand that the governing body members do not ever find themselves in Nissan Micras or anything similar. That they are the one I saw firsthand was in a Cadillac, and then of course Bottlegate. You remember there was Anthony Morris in his Cadillac, and they also have been known to have Mercedes SUVs. So they have all these fancy vehicles that are paid for with dedicated funds, but then they tell the worker bee Jehovah's Witnesses, well, just show them an image of an angel helping them in their terrible car get up that hill. Yeah. They'll feel great, and they'll feel extra righteous for being simple, even though we are not. That part just blew me away. But at least they debranded it so you didn't know what kind of car it was if you didn't use Google like I did.
Yeah, they didn't want to be seen to be advertising for Nissan, I guess.
I wouldn't advertise for that car either.
What stood out to me is that they share the story that had a good outcome when they talk about angels directing the preaching work. And that's almost always how it is. They say the angels are directing the preaching work, the ministry, and so here's this good outcome, here's this good outcome. But if they really feel that way, why do they never comment on what are the angels doing when witnesses are in door-to-door ministry and they're attacked, or attacked by householders' dogs, or like these terrible things happen while they're in the door-to-door work? Where are the angels then? But also, you're going to tell me that angels are overseeing the Jehovah's Witness ministry work, while simultaneously the door-to-door work is dying out at an increasingly quick rate. So those two ideas just don't gel for me.
Yeah, makes no sense whatsoever. And you covered this really well on your channel, where you talked about the danger of going out in the door-to-door ministry, and then the real experiences of people who have suffered because of this door-to-door witnessing policy. Yeah, and I just find again this kind of disrespectful attitude even to the angels. Like the guy in the talk, he's a US branch committee members, and he says, as he quips there, the angels are now even working in supermarkets. and then this idea here of you can just drive through, you can drive recklessly, you can drive through like a muddy puddle where you're likely to get stuck with the expectation that an angel will just turn up for you and pull you through that situation. And I thought this was a religion that had, especially in the 90s when I was growing up, they would publish watchtower after watchtower saying there is no such thing as guardian angels. But it seems like that's the direction they're going in now with their view of angels. So they're just like dumbing it down so much for for the average Jehovah's Witness that their doctrine starts to make no sense whatsoever. Not that it has ever made any sense.
That's a good point. I hadn't thought about that.
Yeah. Anyway, moving on to the sixth thing we learned from the 2024 convention, and it is that the governing body are not ashamed to invent stuff for their Jesus movie.
And he came and settled in a city named Nazareth, in order to fulfill what was spoken through the prophets. He will be called a Nazarene.
And Jesus went on progressing in wisdom and in physical growth, and in favor with God and men.
The true light that gives light to every sort of man was about to come into the world.
I mean, they're clearly adding a lot of, production value, a lot of like studio flair to the story of Jesus. And I think that's okay to the extent that you make that clear to the viewer. We just real quickly earlier talked about The Chosen. They specifically say, this is an embellished story based on the life of Jesus. What we think he potentially could have, done on a day-to-day basis. And if you want to tell that type of story, that's fine. If you want to embellish it based on like cultural context clues, sure. But witnesses always say that they never add to or take away from scripture. So if they're presenting it to the viewer as this is, factual, this is the way it was, I feel like that's misleading. I think they should just be honest, say, yeah, this is like an interpretation of what we, potentially think his life before he began ministry was like.
Totally agree.
Yeah. I went and Googled what does the Bible say about adding to the Bible? And there is a ream of scriptures that just, and it says things from, if anybody adds anything, then they're a false prophet. One of them, there's going to be plagues from God for that guy. There's a big mess if you add to it. And but then we see this video not, having a disclaimer on it that we added this, like Falon said, and you've got Joseph leading his family in family worship. And, they even raised their hands. What?
That got me.
They're all sitting around. And it's amazing. And of course, there's no mention in any of the Bible that the Hebrew people, the Israelites, ever had any sort of family worship apart from the other many things they did to worship God. No mention of it whatsoever. And of that, of course, is because if you were a Hebrew, you didn't need to be indoctrinated constantly like you do if you're a Jehovah's Witness. So yeah, they really are stepping on their own toes here with it. The production value is pretty good. That's not bad. I mean, you can see the sets, but still, what are you doing? What are you doing? Adding all this stuff.
Yeah, and I think the problem is with just to both your points about them adding in stuff is it's not just that they're not making a disclaimer that they're adding in stuff. They're making a strong case that this is a video, the first of its kind, because they're just gonna stick to what the scriptures say. That's the case they're presenting to Jehovah's Witnesses. And to their credit, most of the dialogue that was in, I would say 99% of the dialogue was lifted word for word from the New World Translation. Even the narration was, except the last bit there that we heard, that was actually inserted in, and Arthur pointed it out when him and me reviewed this whole video. But the difficulty is you're claiming to be sticking 100% to the Bible, and then you're just adding in stuff that didn't exist. And I believe, I strongly believe that as this series continues, they're going to become more and more ambitious. So in the first video, they've obviously tried to present it like this is exactly how it was. We're going verbatim what was said and whatever. But they, as it progresses, they're going to make it more Jehovah's Witness centric, such that they're going to be superimposing things that are part of the Jehovah's Witness life now into the life of Jesus, so that they make Jesus look as much a Jehovah's Witness, the 21st century Jehovah's Witness as he possibly can be.
I like that angle. Yeah, that makes sense.
So moving on to the seventh thing we gleaned from the 2024 Jehovah's Witnesses Convention, it is that the no blood rule, the prohibition against using blood for medical reasons, is here to stay.
I received a phone call that a sister had passed away while giving birth. When people in the area heard that our sister had died, they got angry. They assumed that our sister had died because of having refused a blood transfusion. We were also relieved when the medical officials explained why our sister died. That it was not because she refused the blood transfusion. That really was an answer to our prayers.
Personally, I don't have too much to add to that because I've made a standalone video in which I've discussed, I've played this segment from the convention in its entirety, and I've given my comments, so you guys can just add your comments in terms of what you think about that segment.
I just think this is the one thing they can never go back on. You could maybe change your policy on Christmas. It would cause a big upset, but you could do it. You can change your stance on the generations in 1940. All right. But so many people have died or have had family members, faithful witnesses that died as a result of this policy. Like they're past the point of no return. Like they can't. I feel like that would be the end of the organization if they said, okay, now blood's fine. I think that would cause a revolt, and that would pretty much be over.
It's a very good point.
And it is. I think you did cover this, Chaka. That the point they were relieved over was that she didn't die from a lack of blood transfusion. Well, that's awful. She, still passed away. But I know this happened in the case of a very close friend of mine and family member. She died, and they said, well, she died because of this reason. She had this disorder. But she couldn't get a liver transplant that was available to her because she wouldn't take a blood transfusion. And the liver transplant would have helped her with that disorder and given her another decade. So they can say, oh, it was, the years of lupus and another autoimmune disease that they're chewing up her liver. That's what killed her. It didn't have anything to do with not taking the blood. Nonsense. What killed her was that she wouldn't accept the medical treatment that involved taking blood. That would have extended her life. So we don't even really know if that's true or not. But they found an angle so that they could get the locals off of them that were angry, and probably rightfully so angry that she didn't accept all the life-saving attempts that she could have if she hadn't been held back by the organization.
Yeah, indeed. And thanks for sharing that experience, Jason. And sorry to hear about that. But again, as long as they maintain this policy, and very sadly, men, women, children will continue to die as a result of this shocking policy. Anyway, moving on to the next segment. This is going to be an extended clip, and I have covered this on the channel already in the video where I talk about the changes that I expect to happen in the religion. But I think this is so significant that it bears playing as much of this clip that was part of the 2024 convention. And the lesson is that the door-to-door ministry is on its way out.
Good. So that's the end of lesson 22. Take a look at this week's goal.
Think of one person with whom you could share the good news. Think about what to say, how to say it, and when to say it.
I can't deal with that right now. With everything happening in the world, inflation is killing my business. I just have bigger problems to think about.
But what's bigger than inner peace?
Making payroll.
Your brother is a Neanderthal.
Look, it's not my fault the world's a mess. What do you guys think?
So, what did you say?
You totally froze. Here's the question. Do you think God hears our prayers? Is that something that you've wondered about?
Good morning. We're asking our neighbors a question. Do you think God hears our prayers?
But does God hear our prayers? Have you ever wondered that? Psalm 65:2 answers the question. And it says, I've got to try something different. Well, the angels know we showed up.
No one?
Nope. You?
No.
Oh yeah, I'm out here meeting men. What is wrong with you?
Oh, miss, your phone. Oh, hello.
Senior laughed bad. I'm so sorry.
That's okay. It's okay. He's just making friends, aren't you, senor? Oh, are you okay?
Men. You wouldn't know it, but I handle fluff better.
Well, men and dogs are different despite what you hear. I'm Ellie.
Elba.
My husband and I moved here a couple years ago. You?
Same. We moved for Robert's job.
What does he do?
He's a supervisor.
Honestly, it's been really eye-opening. We didn't know the Bible was so practical. We love what we're learning.
And I feel like we finally have something we're doing together.
But we have a question.
Shoot.
So we're with my folks, and they start talking about how bad the world is getting. And we just kind of, I don't know.
Rose?
Exactly.
So I think I've said what I have to say on this sequence we've just seen here. So I'll let you guys just go for it.
Well, I live in the hipster capital of the world, I think, near Portland, Oregon, and I think they nailed the wardrobe. Good job. I think I even have that one guy's outfit. That's pretty embarrassing. But I love the way people talk, and a little bit of a throwback to the woman who got the a callback to the woman who got the letter and pulled it out in the grocery store. She's like, "It's so encouraging." And then this guy says at their study, "Honestly, it's been so eye-opening. We love what we're learning." People don't talk like that. I mean, this was written in a script, but the other one was supposed to be an experience that happened. No, she did not say it's so encouraging in the middle of the. She did not use Jehovah's Witness, like she'd been indoctrinated for
Lingo.
years.
Yeah.
Lingo, thank you. Oh my gosh. Anyway, but they're finally getting it. It's completely useless to knock on people's doors. And the first thing, I don't know about you guys, but if somebody knocks on my door, and I said this before, if it's not UPS or the Amazon guy, I'm like, oh gosh, who's at my door? I'm immediately like turned off to hear whatever they have to say.
Yeah. 100%.
I'm sorry if you hear my clock going off in the other room.
We love a good clock.
What stood out to me was what struck me, it was almost like they were validating the way current witnesses feel about going door to door, that it's miserable. The way they're portraying it almost like a comedy, like all these wacky householders that are not interested. And then even the music, like the tempo of the music was kind of like silly when it was showing them like going to all these different houses. So I feel like they were subtly trying to say like, yeah, we know it's miserable and ridiculous and no one communicates this way anymore. And I also want to say that if cart witnessing had been a thing when I was pioneering, I would have been making my hours like crazy, just waiting for people to come to me. Oh man. Yeah.
And you're just chilling at the cart. You're just talking to fellow Jehovah's Witnesses. And the only action you ever get is other Jehovah's Witnesses walking by. And the most exciting is when you have Jehovah's Witnesses from other parts of the world and they stop by the cart and they tell you where they're from.
That's a dream assignment.
Yeah. And it's an easy 3-4 hours. And if you do like 3 of those shifts a week, that's you done, right? Yeah. But going back to your point, Falon, about them literally parodying themselves with this is why I think at this year's annual meeting they will make an announcement that they're no longer doing the door-to-door ministry. I mean, I'll be very surprised if they don't announce that. But why would they show such a sequence at a convention if they're not about to phase the whole thing out? Moving on to the 9th thing we learned from this year's convention, and it is that the Jehovah's Witnesses proactively seek out criminals for recruitment into the religion.
I was barely making any money, so I started hanging around with some people who were selling drugs. That was when eventually I started to sell some drugs too. As time went by, my business grew because people were buying from me. It was nighttime, I was asleep, and I heard someone knocking on my door. I thought, at this time of night? And it was the police, fully armed. There was nothing I could do about the charges that were raised against me. They had proof of everything.
I have the privilege of preaching in prisons. The fact that you can still share the good news, it gives you a sense of peace. And you feel privileged to have shared something so meaningful with another person. And over time, you see them make changes.
You know, Paulo,
yeah?
I remember the first day I met you when you came to visit the prison. I was so happy. From that point, when we started our Bible study, you have always been like a father to me.
So again, I've covered this extensively. I've shown pretty much most of the sequence that was shown at the convention regarding this experience in a separate video. So I don't have anything to add to that. So I'll just let you guys go for it.
Go ahead, Jay.
Well, I mean, obviously it gives an example of somebody who was dealing drugs that were illegal in that country. You have no idea what it was, but it also going into prisons not only takes advantage of certain people that are in there at their lowest, and then takes advantage of them, but also this organization already has a problem with offenders of a certain type that we won't say for the algorithm here. There's those offenders are flocking to this organization because of the security and safety they have. Why are you going into places that no doubt are housing a higher percentage of those offenders and really working to get them into your organization? That's a recipe for additional disaster.
100%. Yeah.
Yeah, just basically the same thing. Witnesses will say, well, everyone deserves to hear the good news. You know, that learning the truth can change anybody. But they didn't share the story of an offender in prison being contacted. They shared more like a petty criminal, like, you know, low-level drug dealing. So I would just say to a JW, would you be so eager to accept someone into your congregation if the crime was different?
Yeah. Anyway, I think it's concerning because we've had even experiences of people that were murderers that have been brought into the religion like it's nothing. I mean, again, we're not saying people can't move on, but it's just like, what measures are you putting in place to protect the people that this offender might come into contact with, which is not addressed in any way, shape, or form.
Yeah.
Anyway, so moving on to the 10th thing we picked up from the 2024 convention, it is that the polemic against higher education continues.
I wanted to be able to devote everything I had to Jehovah's service. But there were times when I wanted to go to university and see how far I could go in this world. Instead of letting my feelings dictate what I should do, I decided to think things through. I thought of Paul's example. He had received education, and he had riches, fame, and position. However, he said they were rubbish to him. If that was the case, I thought whatever I would be gaining would be even more worthless. I chose to work part-time as a water meter reader. I had dedicated myself to Jehovah, so I wanted to give him back my all. I was able to spend more time in Jehovah's service.
I think this video speaks very much to the points you were making in your most recent videos about your most recent video rather, about the governing body deliberately trying to keep Jehovah's Witnesses poor. So anyway, let's hear your thoughts.
Yeah, it's just, it's a method of control. When I was in high school, people have often asked me as an adult, like, oh, why didn't you go to college after high school? And it wasn't that I decided not to go to college. That was just never even like a consideration. That was just never even like discussed on the radar. It wasn't even an option. The plan from my birth was literally always to just graduate and get right into full-time service. So how it's portrayed that it's this big sacrifice and it makes you more holy to be broke and scraping by is just total nonsense.
It is.
Well, I think I am far and away the least educated of the three of us. I barely have eked out a high school education, but and this is a perfectly honorable profession this guy is in.
Sure.
You know, you got to have meter readers now, but if I'm not mistaken, he was in Japan, and he was, which is a very tech-driven country, and very soon, it's not going to go 40 years that he needs for his career as a meter reader. Very soon, they're not going to need somebody to go around and check the meters. So this is, to me, exactly what the organization does. Is it provides very, very short-term solutions. This is not something that he can do a savings for retirement on. This is a live paycheck to paycheck situation. He's only working part-time, and it's not a long-term solution. You don't. It's just very much a thing that's going to be phased out by tech. So, but they don't care what happens to the individual workers in Jehovah's Witnesses. They're fine with them having a short-term Band-Aid solution, and then whatever, we'll just figure it out next if the end doesn't come. And that's just a recipe for disaster financially for people.
100%. And then it's interesting, picking up on your point there, Jason, because in the May 2024 JW broadcasting, which I covered segments of it on the channel. They actually show this guy who was offered I think it was like some kind of a scholarship, but at least he was offered an opportunity to go to university. And he declined that opportunity. And then he started working. It looked like he was working in some kind of a lab. And then eventually got to a point where they couldn't keep him in that employment unless he went and did a degree. So just like as you were saying there, just they're actually contradicting themselves in their own videos, in their propaganda material, because they're showing that actually listening to their advice just leads to disaster. So this guy then had to eventually find another job, and it's similar to what you're saying about the technology advancing in Japan. And again, if you think about this prohibition against higher education, well, they officially claim it's not a prohibition, but there are real world consequences if you pursue higher education. So if you're an elder, you or any of your family pursue higher education, you will be removed as an elder. If you're a pioneer, you lose those privileges. You'll be looked down on in the congregation. So that is a prohibition in my mind. But it's one of those things that they can just easily drop. They can just, if they want, they can just stop talking about it, or they can just say it's a conscience matter or whatever. but they continue this polemic against higher education and then they're making these meaningless changes of, oh, you can come to the Kingdom Hall without a tie, you can have a beard, you can wear pants if you're a woman, when they could easily just say, well, we understand where the world is heading and how difficult it is for people who don't have a higher education, especially in some countries, like in African countries particularly, it's really, really difficult to earn any sort of decent living without a higher education. Why not just say, we understand the circumstances, just be careful with association and all that, but they won't, and they'll continue this polemic.
Yeah, that's not a risk they can take to say it's conscience matter. That means for some of you it's okay, and that's just not a risk statement they're willing to make.
Yeah, crazy. So the penultimate point we picked up from the 2024 convention is that mental health issues are not taken seriously by the Jehovah's Witness leadership.
I experienced civil unrest from the time I was born. I thought it was unfair that so many people were killed, maimed, injured, and had their lives ruined. I joined the army when I was 18 years old. As a soldier, I experienced the immense pain that war causes. For many years after, whenever I heard news reports about wars and about civil unrest, I got upset. I had nightmares. I experienced the war all over again. When I met Jehovah's Witnesses, I realized that they can deal with bad news better with hope. Isaiah 65:17 deeply touched my heart, and it still does. The scripture contains Jehovah's promise that the former things will not be called to mind. This verse helped me calm down. It made me feel great, so I read it over and over again. Gradually, the truths of God's word stabilized me. They healed my mental disposition. My hope counteracts negative feelings so that I can live with inner peace.
Where do I even begin? I find this extremely infuriating as somebody who works in the mental health field, who deals with similar things where people are suffering from PTSD. So they're depicting a guy who has literal PTSD from the war. And apparently the cure is just reading the scripture in Isaiah. So he reads the scripture and the actual words he uses is, I was healed from my mental disposition. Absolute nonsense. Like PTSD, ask any professional. You don't even have to ask any professional. Just go on Google and just look at the recovery rates and the relapse rates for PTSD. This is the hardest, well, I won't say the hardest, but it is one of the hardest mental health conditions to treat. And the Jehovah's Witnesses are just treating it like it's nothing. Like you can just offer a prayer and it goes away. Like
pray it away.
You
Yeah.
pray it away, pray it away. Like people come for therapy, and even the therapy is so intense that not everybody can withstand the therapy for PTSD. That's number one. And even if people withstand that therapy, they go through that therapy, the chances of recovery are statistically quite low. The third point is it has a high relapse rate. That's the point. And the fourth point it is that it has high comorbidity, in that there are other associated mental health disorders that come with PTSD. So you have depression. It's definitely 100%. If somebody has PTSD, they always invariably have depression. Then there's other things like alcohol abuse, problems with relationships, and so on. And they just have no clue. The Jehovah's Witness leadership have no clue, and then they're giving this nonsensical advice to people, like, if you just become a Jehovah's Witness, you have PTSD, you're gonna be cured automatically. And the thing is that the hypocrisy of the Jehovah's Witness leadership just knows no end. Because when I was still in the religion, I met a branch committee member, and as soon as he found out that I was a cognitive behavioral therapist, he said, "You need to send us your CV because we need CBT therapists. We've got people that are coming from missionary assignments that have PTSD, and they would feel more comfortable being treated by a fellow Jehovah's Witness." So even they themselves realize amongst themselves that there are people struggling with this, and they're getting professional mental health for them. But what they will say to the rank and file is just pray it away.
It's upsetting to me on a personal level, especially the topic of PTSD among even all other mental illnesses or mental struggles, emotional struggles. My husband is a 25-year law enforcement veteran, and he has struggled with PTSD since his retirement. And it doesn't just affect the sufferer, it affects the whole family. So it's something that we've all been working to deal with over the last however many years. So the idea that you're just going to be healed by studying the Bible, or specifically studying the Bible with Jehovah's Witnesses, is ridiculous. If you're drowning, you don't need a prayer, you need a life jacket. That's not just right. Prayer might not bring you comfort. Of course it is. It could. My husband is a devout Christian, and his faith also helps comfort him. It's a wonderful, and for him, a healthy adjunct to clinical therapy and professional mental health services, but one in no way should replace the other.
Yeah, 100%. Thanks for sharing your experience there, Falon, with them.
Yeah, I've never served like Falon's husband has, or this guy has, so I don't have that PTSD, but I do know from 37 years of being a Jehovah's Witness, obviously about 17 of those as an adult outside my parents' home. My mental health was a real big mess. And about 4 years ago, I started seeing a therapist, and then I finally got a therapist who specialized in religious trauma about 2.5 years ago. And the difference in my mental health and the way I function and the way I don't practice avoidance of certain things that trigger my amygdala, all these things, it's huge, the benefit to my life. And that is coming from a person who didn't have the same level of trauma. So I think I can't speak more highly of therapy. It's fantastically helpful. And again, the difference is night and day. I got none of that from hoping and praying and thinking positive thoughts about the new system.
Yeah. So misleading information all the way. Anyway, we need to move on to the final point, the 12th point we gleaned from the 2024 convention. And it is surprisingly, for me anyway, that the 1914 doctrine is here to stay.
In its very first verse, this thrilling Bible book is described as a revelation by Jesus Christ. It foretells events that occurred during the Lord's Day. That is the period that began when our Lord Jesus became king in 1914 and continues until the end of his 1,000-year reign.
So I spoke about this briefly when Arthur and I reviewed this dramatic Bible reading. And I don't think I have much more to add to what I said in that video, so I'll let you guys go for it.
I would just encourage anybody that's still clinging to the 1914 doctrine, rather than just taking something from this most recent video, do your own research and find out the origins of the 1914 ideology, and then reevaluate. It's one thing if you were born 24 years ago, 1914 has just always been, but they don't really ever give modern day witnesses much backstory. They'll just say, oh, it's based on Bible calculations, but there's so much more to it than that. And they also talk about how they don't want witnesses to be involved in numerology or add too much credence to like the calculation of numbers, but that's literally what all this hinges on, what the 1914 year hinges on. So I would say do your old school research and then compare it to the video from the convention.
100%.
Right. And I noticed it just wouldn't be that hard for them to say, oh, you know what, we got the destruction of Jerusalem wrong. Turns out we were 20 years off. Actually, the time of the end began in 1934. And the obviously argument there is that, I mean, Duesenberg was making a great car then. Not much else happened. There's no start of a new world war happening in 1934. So it doesn't really work for that narrative, but they could say something. You can imagine the governing body saying, well, these world wars, these are small skirmishes in the eternal life view that God sees everything. Of course they aren't. The world war was horrible, but they can't just say we got that wrong. And it would actually take the pressure off of them a little bit. It'd add 20 years of cushion for them. They go, oh, well, we're only 90 years into the time of the end now in 2024. So, keep watching and we'll give you more updates. They don't do that. They just dig their heels in, and that's what they do with everything. And finally, I learned from this video that when Jesus gets to heaven, he is even whiter than when he was on earth. It's amazing how Caucasian that dude is. He makes me look like I have a good tan. It's absurd. Goodness.
Yeah. I mean, being Caucasian will get you far in this organization, I think, is the overall message.
Yeah, 10 out of 10 recommend.
So for any Black, Asian, Hispanic, and so on races that are watching this video, if you have any ambitions of being on the governing body or a helper to the governing body, just forget it. Forget it. It's not happening.
It's a long shot.
It's a very long shot. Any final thoughts, guys, regarding what we've reviewed in relation to the 2024 Declare the Good News Convention?
It was just a lot. It was a lot to take in. Even if you are fully indoctrinated, fully believing, I still think that was a lot to cover, a lot to process in just 3 days.
100%, yeah.
It's just every time, I said it before, it just they dig their heels in on stuff that they could change, that would be just fine. It wouldn't be the end of the world to change these certain things. I think they couldn't change the blood thing, because then they just have lawsuits on their hands of people who didn't get blood that needed it. But just other little doctrinal things they could change. They could go, oh, we have some new research from scholars. They don't have any of that humility, and they accidentally show their card every single time with every new talk that they've written and every new video they film. They show that they have absolutely zero humility, and yeah, that's it.
And they had the perfect out. They said on the broadcast, we're not infallible. So that was perfect opportunity to make changes, but
no,
not this time.
Yeah. And when we get things wrong, we're not even going to bother apologizing.
No.
Yeah. Yeah. Anyway, so I think just one surprise for me, it's not really a surprise. I think one thing that we didn't see in this convention was there was no talk about shunning, which is not surprising to me because of the pressure they are under from the Norwegian government and activists and so on. And I think we're going to hear a lot more about that in the 2024 annual meeting. I think they will make more concessions with regards to the shunning policy. So I guess you could argue that that's kind of a positive. I think the changes they have made so far are kind of meaningless. But it's good that the pressure is at least moving them. And any of the changes they're making, as I've argued on other videos, is any of these changes that they're making is not because the Holy Spirit or anything. It's just because of the pressure. Their hand is being forced into these changes. It has nothing to do with praying, the Holy Spirit, reading the Bible, new light, whatsoever. Because if they could have it their way, they would just maintain the status quo as it is.
Yeah, and I think it's a little bit of a reprieve for people who are currently being shunned, because typically after the convention is when families kind of double down on the shunning. Maybe they've sent a couple of text messages or made a couple of calls and like lightened up a little bit. But when the program comes out in the summer, that's when they really kind of back up, double down on the shunning. So maybe people who are being actively shunned, like us, will also have a little bit of that pressure taken away.
If only we weren't apostates.
If only.
The worst sin ever. The worst sin ever. Yeah. Anyway, so thank you so much, Falon and Jason, for going through this. I know it can be quite traumatic to dip into this stuff. This is why I used to, up until recently, I used to do a show that I used to call the Alternative Watch Study, but it was just like every week I'd had to go into the stuff again. So I was just like, I can't do this anymore. So
I've seen that. I don't know how you did it. It was amazing.
Yeah, so put a pause on that because but so I appreciate, because I think your channel, you don't really go into the material as much as I do. So I appreciate that. That's a bit of a change for you. So I really appreciate your points covering this topic with me. And I hope I'll see you. We'll see you again on this channel.
It's a deal.
And we'll probably do some other activist work together in the future. Yeah. So audience, please don't forget to like this video if you enjoyed it. Please don't forget to subscribe to the Anthony Morris Returns channel. Please also don't forget to subscribe to Falon and Jason's channel, which is called Difficult Childhood. I've put a link in the description so that you can see that there's lots of very, very interesting content, which I myself consume. So if you haven't had a chance to do that, please do that. And I look forward to seeing you on another video. So what we're going to do now is we're going to let Tony Morris do the honors for us.
Sing. As Jehovah's enemies, they're going to vanish like smoke.
But you can't do that, said one of the critics.
That doesn't bother me.
Really? Again? Really? Look at that little enemy of God.
Somehow we dilly and dally, takes us years, and we wonder why.
What are you waiting for?